England, 1784. It was a time when kings still ruled with unquestioned authority, and young women like Margaret, clever of tongue, too clever, some said, could lose their futures with a single ill-timed remark. Before we step into Thornwyck Palace, where one such remark would change the course of a maid's life forever, go ahead and like this video. If, by the end, it hasn't earned that click, you may feel entirely free to unlike it. No hard feelings. Now, let us begin with a king, a secret, and a punishment that would start the most unexpected of fairy tales. The parchment trembled in King Leopold's hand. For a man who commanded armies, the weight of a single quill was, at times, unbearable. He sat alone in the blue study, the room lit only by the grey slant of a dawn that promised rain. Before him lay a half-finished letter, the ink still wet with words that had taken him 28 years to write. To the child I wronged. His gaze drifted to the portrait of Queen Catherine, his gentle, loyal wife, hanging over the hearth. A wave of guilt washed over him. He loved her dearly, but their shared grief was a quiet cornerstone of their reign. 20 years of a peaceful, devoted marriage, and the one thing the kingdom required, an heir, she could not provide. The royal physicians had confirmed it years ago with quiet finality. There would be no children, and so the crown had no future. None except for the ghost of a boy, born from a passion he had been forced to discard. The memory was a sharp, clean pain. With a final decisive stroke, he signed his name, sealed the letter with the royal crest, and summoned a messenger. "Eastwood Village," the king commanded, his voice a low gravel. "Find a Lady Evelyn. She will know where to deliver it." The messenger bowed and disappeared, leaving Leopold alone with the echo of a choice made a lifetime ago. The first move in a game of fate had been played. In a modest home in Eastwood, a woman with silvering hair held the letter bearing the king's seal. Lady Evelyn passed it to the young man who stood by the window, his posture straight, his features a striking echo of the man who had sent it. He read the contents, his face impassive. "Come to Thornwyck. There is something you must know." It was signed simply, "Leopold. He summons you as a king," his mother said softly. The young man, Philip, folded the parchment with slow precision. "He abandoned me as a man. I will not answer to the crown what the father refused to acknowledge. He had decided long ago that if he ever met his father, it would be on his own terms. He would see the man, not the monarch. I will go to Thornwyck," he declared, his voice firm, "but not as his son. I will go as a servant." Weeks later, within the grand stone walls of Thornwyck Palace, a new footman named Philip moved through the corridors with a quiet efficiency that made him nearly invisible. It was exactly what he wanted. He observed the rhythms of the court, the hushed gossip of the staff, and the cold, empty distance of the king he was meant to call father. And he observed Margaret. He first saw her in the Queen's chambers, where Queen Catherine settled back against her pillows as Margaret prepared to tell the evening story. To ensure anyone listening would understand, Margaret's voice shifted, taking on the soft, lilting cadence she reserved for her fairy tales. "The story begins," Margaret said clearly, "with a runaway bride who whispered to the wind as she fled the palace, 'If I must leave behind a crown, then let my freedom be my kingdom instead.' The Queen listened, captivated, until the tale's sweet conclusion. A perfect Margaret ending, she sighed, before they both recited their nightly ritual in a shared whisper. And so, until the stars return, we dream. From his post in the hall, Philip watched her leave the chambers. He had heard the other servants call her the fairy tale maid. He saw her wit when she passed the jealous maid, Geneva, and left her speechless with a clever remark. There was a light about her, a blend of kindness and spirit, that drew his eye more than any of the palace's gilded treasures. That evening, during a formal dinner, Margaret stood near the Queen's chair, her proper station. The king's gaze, cold and distant, swept the room and landed on her. The silence from Eastwood, No reply had yet come, had curdled his mood. "Girl," he said, his voice carrying, "you will serve the wine." A hush fell. Serving was not Margaret's duty. "Your Majesty," Margaret began, curtsying deeply. "It is not my place, and Her Majesty has requested my attendance." "Leopold," Queen Catherine interjected gently, "Margaret is not a hall maid." But the king's eyes remained fixed on Margaret, hard and unyielding. "I gave you an order." Margaret held her ground, her voice respectful but unwavering. "An order I must, with all deference, decline, my king. My duty is to the Queen tonight." The air crackled. The king did not raise his voice. He did something far more terrifying. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Very well," he said, his voice a blade of ice. "You are dismissed. See me in my study. At once." He turned back to his guests as if nothing had happened, leaving Margaret standing alone, the eyes of the entire room on her. From across the hall, Philip watched, his jaw tight. He knew with absolute certainty that her fairy tale was about to meet a very cruel reality. The walk to the king's study was the longest of Margaret's life. Each step on the marble floor echoed in the cavernous silence of the corridor, a funereal drumbeat marking the end of the life she knew. The two royal guards standing beside the great oak doors looked straight through her, their faces impassive stone. One of them pulled the door open without a word, and she stepped inside. The blue study, which had always seemed a place of quiet authority, now felt like a tomb. King Leopold stood with his back to her, staring out the window at the manicured gardens below. He did not turn. "You believe yourself to be clever, girl," he began, his voice low and devoid of warmth. "You have the ear of the Queen. You have the affection of the staff. You fill their heads with foolish stories of common girls wedding princes." Margaret remained silent, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. "It is a dangerous delusion," the king continued, finally turning to face her. His eyes were not angry. They were cold, like chips of winter ice. "And it is my duty to cure you of it. You wish for a storybook ending? You shall have one. A cautionary tale." He moved to his desk, his movements slow and deliberate. "You will be married. By the end of the week. Not to a prince, not to a lord, not even to a merchant. You, the fairy tale maid, will be wed to a footman, a man of no name and no consequence. You will be bound to the very station you seem so keen to rise above." The words struck Margaret with the force of a physical blow. The air left her lungs. Marriage. To a stranger. A footman. It was a life sentence, a public shaming designed to break her spirit completely. She felt the blood drain from her face, but her voice, when she found it, was steady. "As you command, Your Majesty," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Indeed," he said, already turning back to the window, dismissing her as if she were no more than a speck of dust. "The royal steward, Mr. Davies, will see to the details. You are dismissed." Margaret curtsied, her body moving on instinct alone. She turned and walked out of the room, her back ramrod straight, and did not allow the first tear to fall until she was hidden in the solitude of a small, forgotten alcove in the west wing. There, she slid to the floor, the sobs she had suppressed tearing through her in silent, ragged waves. Mr. Davies, the royal steward, was a man who lived by ledgers and lists. He was neither kind nor cruel, he was merely efficient. When he received the king's directive, he did not question the strangeness of it. He simply opened his book of household staff. An unmarried footman. He muttered to himself, his finger running down a list of names. Hemsworth is promised to a baker's daughter. Thomas is too young. Alistair, far too fond of the drink. His eyes landed on a new name near the bottom. Philip, no surname listed. From Eastwood. Been here a month. Quiet, diligent, no trouble. He tapped the name with his pen. No family ties, no local connections. Perfect, he will do. Philip was in the west pantry, methodically polishing a set of silver goblets, his mind a world away. He was thinking of Margaret, of the impossible situation he was in. How could he ever earn the king's respect while hiding under his own roof? How could he protect the gentle queen from the king's coldness? Philip, he looked up. Mr. Davies stood in the doorway, his expression as neutral as ever. Philip set down his polishing cloth and stood. Sir. The steward stepped inside, his eyes scanning the polished silver with an approving nod before settling on Philip. By royal decree, Mr. Davies said, his voice flat and official, as if announcing the daily menu. The king has chosen you a bride. Philip stared, certain he had misheard. I beg your pardon. There is no need, the steward replied calmly. The decision is made. You are to be married to the maid, Margaret. The ceremony will be on Friday. The silver goblet Philip had just polished slipped from his hand and clattered to the stone floor, the sound echoing the sudden, deafening chaos in his mind. Margaret, his bride, by the king's command. It was not a fairy tale. It was a nightmare. Friday arrived on the back of a cold, grey morning that saw no sun. The wedding, if one could call it that, was a swift and hollow affair conducted in the palace's smallest, dustiest chapel. There were no flowers, no guests, only Mr. Davies and one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting as witnesses, both looking as though they would rather be anywhere else. Margaret stood woodenly, her simple grey dress a far cry from the fairy tale gowns of her stories. When the priest asked for her vows, her "I will" was a ghost of a sound, a puff of air in the frigid room. Philip's voice, when it was his turn, was quiet but clear, a note of profound sadness woven through it. He looked at her only once, a quick sympathetic glance that she refused to meet. In less than 10 minutes it was done. They were bound together by the king's spite. Their new quarters were in the servants' wing, a small, clean room with a low ceiling and a single window overlooking a stone courtyard. It was stark and impersonal, containing little more than a small table, 2 chairs, and 2 narrow cots on opposite walls. The finality of it all settled upon Margaret like a shroud. This was her new life. This was her cage. Philip carried their few belongings inside and set them down, the silence between them thick and suffocating. He seemed unsure of what to do, what to say. But Margaret, having spent the last 2 days in a state of shock, had found a new, harder resolve. She would not be a weeping victim. She would be the master of her own prison. She turned to him, her chin held high, the sky-blue eyes that were usually so full of warmth, now cool and determined. "Let us come to an understanding, Mr. Philip," she began, her voice crisp. "This," she said, gesturing to the small room, "is not a marriage. It is a sentence we are to serve together, a performance, for the king's benefit." Philip watched her, his expression unreadable. He simply nodded for her to continue. "As such, there must be rules," she went on, gaining momentum. "That is your cot," she pointed. "This one is mine. You will have your space, I will have mine, and the air between is a wall you will not cross. We are cellmates, not soulmates. You will perform your duties, and I will perform mine. In public, we will be whatever this is. In private, we are strangers. And there will be," she paused, searching for the right word, "no improvisation." She finished, her chest heaving slightly from the force of her declaration. She expected him to argue, to be angry, perhaps even cruel. Instead, a small, sad smile touched his lips. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not a pawn in the king's game, but a man who looked just as trapped as she was. "A performance it is, then," he said, his voice soft. "I will be a most considerate cellmate, Margaret. You have my word." The easy way he agreed, the lack of a fight, disarmed her completely. She could only give a stiff nod in return before turning away to unpack her meagre things, her carefully constructed anger already beginning to feel flimsy and thin. The next afternoon, there was a soft knock on their door. It was the Queen's lady-in-waiting, who passed Margaret a small, silk-wrapped package and a message that Her Majesty wished to see her in the royal gardens. Margaret found Queen Catherine sitting on a stone bench, looking out over the autumn roses. The Queen's smile was gentle, but her eyes were filled with sorrow. "My dear child," she said, taking Margaret's hands. "There are no words to express my regret. What Leopold did was born of his own pain, but that is no excuse for the cruelty he has shown you." "You have nothing to be sorry for, Your Majesty," Margaret said, her throat tight. "I feel I have failed you," the Queen whispered, pressing the silk package into Margaret's hands. "A small thing. So you remember that you are not forgotten." Later, back in her room, Margaret unwrapped the gift. It was a beautiful, leather-bound book of fables, its pages filled with elegant script. Tucked inside was an embroidered bookmark. A tear she hadn't realized she was holding back slipped down her cheek. As she looked up, her eyes fell on Philip, who had just returned and was watching her from the doorway. He saw the book, saw her tear, and his expression softened with a deep, unspoken empathy. He said nothing, merely giving her a quiet nod before retreating to his side of the room, respecting the invisible wall she had built between them. But as Margaret looked from the Queen's gift to the quiet man across the room, another memory surfaced. The Queen's words from the garden. "The young man has kind eyes, Margaret. He reminds me of Leopold, long ago, before grief made a winter of his heart. Perhaps, give him a chance." She shook her head, dismissing the thought. He was part of her punishment. He was a stranger. And yet, for the first time, a tiny crack appeared in the cold wall of her resolve. The first weeks of their arrangement were a masterclass in polite hostility. Margaret, true to her word, treated their shared quarters not as a home, but as a territory to be defended. A line, invisible but deeply felt, was drawn down the center of the room. His side, her side. Her coldness, however, was laced with her own particular brand of wit. Philip would return from his duties to find his cot made with military precision and a single, perfect wildflower placed on his pillow. When he thanked her, she would sniff and reply, "A splash of color helps one forget the grey walls of their prison." One evening, he noticed a button on his tunic was loose. He set it aside, intending to ask for a needle and thread later. The next morning, he found the tunic neatly folded on his chair, the button stitched on with a skill that was nothing short of artistry. "You fixed my button," he said, a genuine warmth in his voice. Margaret, who was busy brushing her long red hair, didn't turn from the small mirror. "A loose thread is a sign of chaos," she stated primly. "I will not have chaos in my cell." Philip couldn't help but chuckle. He was not a husband, he was chaos. He found her stubborn pride and the kindness she tried so desperately to hide utterly captivating. His own kindness was quieter. He began leaving a warm roll and a piece of cheese for her from the kitchens, knowing she often missed the evening meal. He never mentioned it, and she never acknowledged it, but he knew she ate it. They were two ghosts haunting the same small space, communicating in unspoken acts of care. The dynamic shifted one afternoon in the main hall. Geneva, the jealous maid, saw Margaret arranging flowers and could not resist a barb. "Well, well," she said loudly, "if it isn't the footman's wife. Tell me, is married life as grand as the fairy tales you tell?" Margaret's jaw tightened, but before she could retort, Philip, who was standing duty by the far door, spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the hall with quiet authority. "Her life is grander than you could imagine, Geneva," he said, his eyes fixed on her. "For she possesses a grace and wit that no title can bestow, and no gossip can tarnish." Geneva flushed a deep crimson and scurried away. The hall fell silent. Margaret stared at Philip, stunned into silence. He had defended her, not as a husband, but as an ally. That Sunday, Margaret felt the loneliness of her new position more acutely than ever. Her duties with the Queen had been quietly reassigned. The evenings were the worst. The time she would have been telling stories now spent in silence on her side of the room. A soft knock came at her door. It was the Queen's lady-in-waiting. "Her Majesty requests your presence. She is walking in the south garden." Margaret found Queen Catherine by a fountain, her expression gentle. "I have missed our stories, Margaret," the Queen said, her voice soft. "Walk with me." As they strolled along the gravel paths, the Queen was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "I know my husband's decree has caused you great pain. I want you to understand, it does not come from a place of malice, but from a deep, old wound." Margaret listened, her curiosity piqued. "Before he was a king, before he was my husband," the Queen continued, her gaze distant. "Leopold's heart belonged to another. His first love. He has never, I think, truly recovered from losing her. And his bitterness, it is the ghost of that loss. Sometimes." The Queen paused, looking at Margaret with sad, knowing eyes. "When he sees a young woman with fire in her spirit and wit on her tongue, I believe he is not seeing you at all. He is seeing her." Philip's defense of her in the main hall had changed the air between them. The invisible wall in their small room did not disappear, but it became porous, allowing quiet glances and small, hesitant smiles to pass through. Margaret found herself watching him, her mind replaying the Queen's words. "He is not seeing you at all. He is seeing her." She looked at the king during formal duties and saw not a tyrant, but the ghost of a heartbroken boy. The following Sunday, as she had hoped, the Queen once again requested her company in the garden. The air was crisp, and the scent of late-blooming lavender hung in the air. "I have been thinking of our conversation," the Queen began as they walked, her hands clasped behind her back. "About the king's lost love. It is a sad tale, perhaps the saddest I know." "You knew her, Your Majesty?" Margaret asked softly. "I never met her," the Queen replied, a wistful smile on her face. "But I have heard the stories from those who did. She was not a lady of the court, Margaret. She was not a duchess or a baroness." The Queen stopped and turned, her eyes meeting Margaret's with a profound, startling intensity. "She was a maid, here, in this very palace, spirited and clever, with a tongue as sharp as yours. Her name was Evelyn." The world seemed to tilt beneath Margaret's feet. A maid, the king's great love, the woman whose ghost still haunted the halls of his heart, had been just like her. Suddenly his cruelty made a terrible kind of sense. It was not just her station he despised, it was the memory of a love he had been forced to abandon. What happened to her?" Margaret whispered. "The king's parents, the old king and queen, discovered their affair when she—" The Queen trailed off, her eyes fixed on something over Margaret's shoulder. A royal courier was approaching at a hurried pace. He bowed low. "Your Majesty, an urgent message from your brother." The Queen took the offered scroll, her expression shifting from remembrance to concern. She gave Margaret an apologetic look. "Forgive me, my dear. We must continue this another time." She walked away, leaving Margaret standing alone in the garden, her mind reeling with the unfinished story. When she what? That night, sleep would not come. Margaret lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, the name Evelyn echoing in her thoughts. A soft scratching sound drew her attention. Across the room, a sliver of light glowed from Philip's side. He was awake. Driven by a curiosity that was now stronger than her pride, she rose from her bed. She padded silently across the cold stone floor, crossing the invisible line for the first time. He was sitting up, a single candle burning on a small stool beside him, a book resting in his hands. He was so absorbed he didn't notice her until she was standing almost beside him. He looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I did not mean to startle you." "It's all right," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. He closed the book, but not before she saw the dense, philosophical text on the page. "What are you reading?" she asked, her voice full of genuine wonder. "The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius," he answered simply. It was the last thing she had expected. A book of Roman philosophy was not the typical reading material for a footman. The mystery of him, the man who defended her with the words of a poet and read like a scholar, deepened. "You are full of surprises, Philip," she breathed. He gave a small, wry smile. "You spoke of stories the first time we truly met, in the stables when I cut my hand." The memory, warm and easy, returned to her. "I believe I offered to marry you for saving your life." "You did?" he said, his smile growing. "A fairy tale offer." "They call me the fairy tale maid, you know," she said, a hint of sadness in her voice as she sat on the edge of her own cot, facing him. "They think I dream of marrying a prince." She looked at her hands, twisting them in her lap. In the warm, flickering candlelight, she felt a sudden, desperate need to tell someone the truth. To tell him. "But the truth is," she said, her voice barely a whisper as she looked up and met his gaze, "I never cared about a crown. I only ever dreamed of finding a man who would treat me like the princesses in my stories, to be cherished. That is the only title I have ever wanted." The air grew still. Philip looked at her, and in his eyes she saw no judgment, no amusement. She saw a deep, profound understanding that seemed to reach into her very soul. The witty defences, the invisible walls, all of it melted away under his steady gaze. He was no longer her jailer or her cellmate. He was just Philip. And she, for the first time, felt she was truly seeing him too. He leaned forward slightly, his voice soft with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "That," he said, "is a dream worthy of a queen." The confession in the candlelight did not just crack the ice between them, it melted it away entirely. The invisible line in their room vanished. Margaret and Philip were no longer cellmates. They were allies, confidants, and in the quiet moments before sleep, they would talk, their voices low whispers in the dark. She told him of her childhood, of the fables her mother used to read to her. He spoke of his love for philosophy, for the idea that a man's character was the only kingdom he could truly rule. He never spoke of his family, and she, sensing a deep well of pain there, never asked. A week later, the palace was abuzz with the arrival of the Duke of Steinbeck, a pompous, sour-faced man known for his wealth and his terrible temper. During a reception in the Grand Hall, the Duke was holding court when a young serving boy, no older than 12, stumbled nearby. A single drop of red wine splashed from the boy's tray onto the Duke's immaculate, silver-buckled shoe. The Duke's face contorted with fury. "You clumsy oaf!" he roared, causing the entire hall to fall silent. "Do you have any idea what these shoes cost? You will be flogged for this!" The boy trembled, his face pale with terror. Before any of the senior staff could intervene, Philip, who was standing duty near the wall, stepped forward. He moved with a calm, unhurried grace that drew every eye. He placed a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder before addressing the Duke. His voice was perfectly level, respectful, but firm, carrying a strange authority that seemed to silence the room. "Your Grace," Philip said, meeting the Duke's furious gaze without flinching. "It was a simple accident. The boy is terrified. Surely a man of your standing can find magnanimity in the face of a harmless mistake." The Duke sputtered, taken aback by the footman's audacity. "And who are you to tell me about my standing? I am merely a servant of this palace," Philip replied smoothly. "And as such, it is my duty to ensure that His Majesty's guests are not so distracted by trivial matters that they cannot enjoy his hospitality." The words were a masterstroke of diplomacy, deferential on the surface, yet a clear, sharp rebuke underneath. The Duke of Steinbeck, finding himself outmaneuvered by a common footman, and with the eyes of the entire court upon him, could do nothing but give a curt, angry nod and turn away. From across the room, Queen Catherine had watched the entire exchange. She held her breath, her hand flying to her throat. It was not just the man's bravery that struck her, but his bearing. The perfect posture, the innate confidence, the calm, commanding presence that could pacify a raging duke. That was not the manner of a footman. It was the manner of a prince. The next Sunday walk felt different. The Queen was quieter, more observant, studying Margaret's face as she spoke. They arrived at their favourite bench overlooking the lake, and the Queen finally continued her story from the week before. "I told you, Evelyn, the maid my husband loved was sent away," she said, her voice heavy with memory. "The old King and Queen discovered their affair because she was with child, Margaret, the King's child." Margaret gasped, her mind spinning. A child. The King had a son. "He never knew what became of them," the Queen went on, twisting the ring on her finger. "He searched, but they had vanished. For 28 years he has lived with that ghost. But it is a ghost he has recently tried to summon." She looked directly at Margaret, her eyes filled with a new, urgent meaning. Not 2 months ago he finally found a lead. He sent a letter, a summons for his son to come to the palace to take his place as the heir. "My God!" Margaret whispered. "He has an heir. So the boy, the man, he is coming." The Queen shook her head, a deep sadness in her eyes. The young man sent a letter in reply. He refused. He wanted no part of the King or his crown. Suddenly, it all clicked into place for Margaret. The King's foul temper, his bitterness, the random, cruel punishment. It had all happened right after he had been rejected by his only son. That night, the Queen sat alone in her chambers, the firelight dancing across her thoughtful face. She stared into the flames, her mind connecting the pieces of a puzzle that was becoming terrifyingly clear. A summons sent to Eastwood, a rejection, and then, mere days later, a new footman arrives. A young man of the right age from Eastwood with no family to speak of, a man named Philip, a man who reads philosophy, who speaks with the grace of a nobleman, and who carries himself like a king. Her heart began to beat faster. It was impossible. It was madness. And yet, it was the only thing that made sense. She rose from her chair, her decision made. She walked to the door and spoke to the guard. "Summon the royal steward for me, at once." The royal steward, Mr. Davies, stood before the Queen in her private solar, a small ledger in his hands. He was a man unaccustomed to urgency, but the Queen's command had been absolute. "Well?" Queen Catherine asked, her voice taut with anticipation. "It is as you suspected, Your Majesty," Davies reported, his voice flat. "The footman, Philip, was hired 5 weeks ago. His letter of introduction came from Eastwood. According to the parish records I requested, his mother is a Lady Evelyn, who inherited a small estate upon the death of her husband, a respected barrister." He paused, then added the final critical detail. "And Lady Evelyn's maiden name was Croft. She was a chambermaid in this palace 28 years ago." The Queen sank into her chair, the last piece of the puzzle clicking into place. It was him. The lost son was here, serving in his own father's house, married to the very maid the King had sought to punish. The irony was so staggering, so cruel, that she felt a wave of dizziness. She had to act, and she had to act now. In their small room, the world outside the palace, the Queen's suspicions, the King's grief, had faded away. For Margaret and Philip, the room was no longer a cage, but a sanctuary. The unspoken truth was that they had fallen deeply, irrevocably in love. One evening Margaret was mending a tear in one of Philip's shirts. He was sitting at the small table, reading aloud to her from his book of philosophy, his deep voice a soothing melody in the quiet. "The best revenge," he read, "is to be unlike him who performed the injury." Margaret looked up from her sewing, her needle stilled. "Is that what you are doing?" she asked softly. He closed the book, his gaze meeting hers. "I am trying." She set her sewing aside and moved to sit on the chair beside him. The air between them was charged with a gentle, unspoken intimacy. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray strand of red hair from her cheek. His touch was electric, and she leaned into it, her eyes fluttering shut. It was not a decision, but an inevitability. He leaned forward and she met him halfway. Their first kiss was not one of fiery passion, but of quiet, profound relief. It was a kiss that tasted of shared secrets and silent understanding, a confirmation of everything their hearts already knew. When they parted, Margaret rested her forehead against his. Her world finally, completely. Right, she had her fairy tale. It wasn't a prince or a crown, it was this kind, intelligent, honourable man. It was Philip. But for Philip, the kiss was both heaven and hell. He was drowning in his love for her, and in the guilt of his deception. He looked at her, at the pure, trusting love in her eyes, a love for a simple footman, and knew he could not let it continue for another moment. The lie was a poison that would destroy the most beautiful thing in his life. He pulled back gently, taking both of her hands in his. His expression was so serious, so full of turmoil that her smile faded. "Margaret," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "there is something I must tell you, something you deserve to know." His grip on her hands tightened. "My name is not the only thing I have kept from you. The truth is—" A sharp, authoritative knock hammered on their door, making them both jump. Philip instinctively moved to stand in front of Margaret. "Who is it?" The voice that answered was stern and unfamiliar. "Royal Guard. By order of the Queen, you are both summoned to her private chambers, immediately." Margaret looked at Philip, her face etched with confusion. Philip's heart turned to ice. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his time had run out. The Queen knew, and everything was about to change. The walk to the Queen's private solar was a torment of silent dread. Margaret, utterly bewildered, kept looking to Philip for an explanation, but his face was a grim, unreadable mask. He simply held her hand, his grip so tight it was almost painful, a silent message of both comfort and warning. They were led through the quiet corridors by the guards, their footsteps echoing like a judgment. They entered the solar to find Queen Catherine standing alone by the hearth, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The room, usually a place of warmth and comfort for Margaret, felt like a courtroom. "Leave us," the Queen commanded the guards, her voice calm but steel-edged. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, sealing the three of them inside. The Queen's eyes, full of a sad, weary wisdom, fell first on Margaret. "My dear," she said gently, "what I am about to say will be difficult to hear. Please, sit." Margaret, her legs suddenly weak, sank into a nearby chair. The Queen then turned her full, unwavering attention to Philip. "When we last spoke in the garden," she said, her voice never rising, "I told Margaret that the King had a son, for whom he recently sent a summons that was rejected." She took a slow step forward. "And mere days after that rejection, a footman arrives from Eastwood, the very village where a maid named Evelyn was sent so many years ago." Philip stood motionless, his face pale. Margaret stared at him, her mind refusing to connect the pieces, to comprehend the impossible thing the Queen was implying. "A footman who reads philosophy," the Queen continued, her voice softening, "who carries himself with the bearing of a nobleman, who has the courage to pacify a duke and the compassion to love a broken-hearted girl." She looked directly at Philip, her gaze piercing. "Your father sought a son. Instead, a footman appeared in his house. Will you not tell me why?" The silence was deafening. Philip finally broke it, his voice rough with emotion. He turned first to Margaret, his eyes a testament of love and apology. "Forgive me," he whispered to her, before facing the Queen. "Everything you say is true, Your Majesty," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I am Philip, son of Evelyn Croft, and of the King." Margaret made a small, wounded sound, her hand flying to her mouth. "Prince." The quiet, gentle man she had married, the man she had just kissed, was the lost prince from her fairy tales. The lie was so enormous, it stole the air from her lungs. "My mother never spoke ill of him," Philip explained, his words now flowing quickly. "She spoke of a young man trapped by duty, not a cruel king. She told me he was good. I could not arrive here and claim a title from a man I did not know. I had to see him for myself. I had to know if the man she loved still existed beneath the crown. He looked again at Margaret, his heart in his eyes. I never meant to deceive you. I began to admire you from afar. And then the king's decree, it trapped us both. And then I fell in love with you, with Margaret, not with the wife a king forced upon me, but with the woman who reads stories and mends tunics and dreams of being cherished. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. The betrayal was real, a sharp sting in her heart. But his reason, it was not born of malice, it was born of honor. She looked at the man she loved and saw not a liar but a son searching for his father. The queen had listened to it all, her expression softening with every word. She saw no deception in him, only his mother's integrity. She saw the pure, unfeigned love between him and Margaret, a love forged in the most impossible of circumstances. "You have your mother's honor, Philip," the queen said, her voice thick with emotion. She stepped forward and, to their astonishment, placed a gentle hand on his arm. "And you have found a love that most royals only ever dream of." She took a deep breath, her regal authority returning. "Your father's heart has been a fortress of grief for 30 years. I have tried to reach him, but I cannot. You are the only one who can." Her eyes were clear and resolute. "He is a broken man, not a monster. But he must learn the truth from you." She stood tall, her decision made. She was no longer just a queen, she was their ally. "And he will learn it now," she declared. "We will go to him, together." The journey to the king's study was a silent procession of 3 hearts beating as one. The queen led them with a regal and determined grace, a protector leading her charges into the lion's den. Margaret's hand was clasped tightly in Philip's, her fear muted by the strength she drew from him. He was no longer a mystery, he was her husband, and she would stand with him, no matter what came next. The queen did not knock. She pushed the heavy oak doors open and swept inside, Philip and Margaret following in her wake. King Leopold sat behind his grand desk, a stack of ledgers before him, his face a mask of weary concentration. He looked up, his brow furrowing in irritation at the intrusion. "Catherine, what is the meaning of this? Why have you brought servants into my private study?" "They are not here as servants, Leopold," the queen said, her voice imbued with a gentle but unbreakable strength. "They are here as family. I ask you for once in your life to set aside the crown and listen with the heart of the man I married." The king stared, bewildered by his wife's strange command. The queen turned and gave Philip a small, encouraging nod. This was his moment. Philip stepped forward, pulling Margaret gently with him. He stood before his father's desk, not with the deference of a footman, but with the quiet dignity of a son. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice clear and calm. "Several weeks ago you sent a letter to a Lady Evelyn in Eastwood, seeking her son." The king's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. "That is a private matter. It does not concern you." "It concerns me more than anyone," Philip stated, "because I am that son. My name is Philip Croft, and you are my father." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire. The king stared, his face a canvas of disbelief that quickly hardened into anger. "This is preposterous, a trick, some ploy for advancement. Look at him, Leopold." The queen interjected, her voice sharp. "Truly look." The king's gaze fell upon Philip again, but this time he was not looking at a servant. He was searching. He saw the line of the jaw that mirrored his own in the portrait on the wall. He saw the proud set of the shoulders, and in the depths of the young man's eyes, he saw her. He saw Evelyn. The anger on his face dissolved, replaced by a wave of shock so profound he seemed to shrink in his chair. "Evelyn," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. "I received your summons," Philip continued, his voice softening with the compassion his mother had taught him. "But I could not accept it. The man my mother spoke of was not a king who gave orders, but a man of honor who had lost his way. I had to see that man for myself before I could call him father. That is why I came to Thornwyck as I did." The king was no longer listening to the words. He was watching his son. The son he had grieved for decades, the heir he had desperately sought, had been polishing his silver, serving his wine, living as a commoner under his own roof. The weight of his own ignorance was crushing. And then his gaze dropped to where Philip and Margaret's hands were still tightly clasped. The final, most horrifying piece of the puzzle slammed into place. The punishment. The cruel, calculated decree born of his own bitterness. He had taken this girl, this innocent girl, and in an act of petty tyranny, he had— "I made you!" the king choked out, the words catching in his throat. He looked from his son to Margaret, the full scope of his monstrous mistake laid bare. "I forced you to marry." He was no longer a king. He was just a man, drowning in a sea of his own making. The cold facade he had maintained for 30 years shattered into a million pieces, revealing the broken, grieving man beneath. He slumped in his chair, his face in his hands, a dry, ragged sob escaping him. After a long moment, he slowly raised his head. He looked past his son, his eyes now shining with unshed tears, finding Margaret. He saw her own tears, her quiet strength, her unwavering support for the man beside her, and his shame was absolute. "My son, he can choose to forgive me or not. That is his right," the king said, his voice a broken whisper. "But you, an innocent, caught in the wreckage of my past." He struggled to meet her gaze. "I have wronged you more than anyone. My dear girl, can you find it in your heart to forgive this foolish, broken old man?" Margaret looked at the king. This powerful man who had built a cage for her, now so utterly broken before her. She saw not a monarch, but a father grieving a lifetime of loss. In his tear-filled eyes, she saw the same pain she had seen in Philip's. She took a step forward, her hand still in her husband's, and gave a small, graceful curtsy. "There is nothing to forgive, Your Majesty," she said, her voice soft but clear, echoing in the silent study. "Only a great deal of sorrow that must now be allowed to heal." Her words, so full of grace where he had shown none, seemed to break the last of his restraint. King Leopold rose from his chair, his movements stiff, and for the first time he opened his arms to his son. Philip went to him, and the two men embraced, a father and a son separated by 3 decades of silence and misunderstanding, finally reunited. The Queen watched them, her own silent tears tracing paths of joy down her cheeks. After a long moment, the king pulled back, his hands resting on Philip's shoulders. A new light was in his eyes, not just relief, but a king's resolve. "This was a private reckoning," he declared, his voice regaining its command, but now tempered with a deep, paternal warmth. "But the truth must be given the light of day. The court must be assembled. The kingdom must know their prince." His gaze then shifted to Margaret, and his expression was filled with a profound and humble respect. "And they will know their princess." An hour later, the grand hall buzzed with confused whispers. The entire court, along with the senior household staff, had been summoned for an unscheduled royal announcement. At the front of the hall, on the royal dais, stood the king and queen, and with them, to everyone's astonishment, stood the footman, Philip, and the maid, Margaret. The king raised a hand, and a hush fell over the assembly. "For 30 years," he began, his voice ringing with an emotion no one had ever heard from him before, "I have carried a private grief. A mistake made in my youth, compounded by the cruelty of others, cost me my firstborn son." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "I believed him lost to me forever," the king continued, his eyes finding Philip. "But fate, in its infinite wisdom, has returned him to this house. He came here not as a prince, but as a man, seeking to understand a father he had never known, and I, in my blindness, failed to see him." He placed a proud hand on Philip's shoulder. "I present to you all my son, my only heir, Prince Philip of Thornwyck." The hall erupted in a tidal wave of shock and excited murmurs. But the king was not finished. He turned to Margaret, who stood beside Philip, her heart pounding. He took her hand, his touch now gentle and fatherly. "In my ignorance and bitterness," the king said, his voice full of regret, "I have done this good woman a great injustice. I sought to punish her for a spirit I should have celebrated. But her grace, her kindness, and her strength have proven that nobility is not a matter of birth, but of character." He raised her hand high for all to see. "By my decree, and with all the love of a father for his daughter, she will henceforth be known not as a maid, but as Her Royal Highness, Princess Margaret." For a moment there was stunned silence. Then, from the back of the hall, the servants, led by a weeping Mrs. Gable, burst into thunderous applause. The cheer was taken up by the court, and soon the hall rang with her new name. "Princess Margaret! Princess Margaret!" Amid the joyous chaos, Queen Catherine leaned close to Margaret, her own eyes shining. "You have your ending, my dear," she whispered. "Princess Margaret." Later that night, Philip and Margaret stood on a private balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens. The weight of their old servants' clothes had been replaced by the fine silk and velvet of their new station, but in the quiet of the evening, they were simply themselves. "It feels like a dream," Margaret whispered, leaning her head on his shoulder. He smiled, wrapping his arm around her. "The best dreams, I'm told, are the ones that come true." He looked down at her, his eyes full of a love so deep it took her breath away. "Princess Margaret." She looked up at him, a playful sparkle returning to her eyes. "You will never grow tired of saying that, will you?" "Never!" He laughed. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the night sky. The journey had been impossible, the pain immense, but it had led them here, together. She thought of all the stories she had ever told, of all the wishes and hopes she had woven into them. Philip kissed the top of her head. "What are you thinking?" She smiled, a true, peaceful smile, and whispered the words that had become their promise, now finally fulfilled. "And so, until the stars return, we dream." The weeks that followed the grand announcement were a dizzying whirlwind for Margaret and Philip. Life became a series of lessons in royal protocol, fittings for new wardrobes, and meetings with dignitaries who were all eager to meet the kingdom's secret prince and his fairy tale princess. Through it all, their love was their anchor. They navigated the strange, gilded new world hand in hand, their bond forged in a servant's quiet quarters, proving stronger than any challenge the court could present. Philip, with his natural intelligence and steady demeanour, took to his new duties with ease. He was a constant, reassuring presence at his father's side, learning the matters of state, his insights proving to be as sharp as his moral compass was true. The staff, who had once been his peers, now looked upon him with a fierce, protective pride. But while the kingdom celebrated, a shadow still lingered in the king's eyes. He was a changed man, gentler, kinder to the queen, and openly proud of his son. Yet a deep, unresolved sorrow clung to him. Margaret would often see him staring into the distance, his thoughts clearly miles and decades away. He had his son back, but the ghost of the woman he had wronged, and the parents who had deceived him, still haunted him. He had been given a second chance, but he had never had the chance to atone for his first mistake. Queen Catherine saw it all. She watched her husband trying to build a new future on the foundations of a broken past, and knew it was not enough. His healing was incomplete. For their family to truly move forward, they had to fully address the wound that had festered for 30 years. One evening, she found him alone in the blue study, not at his desk, but standing before the grand window, looking out at the darkening sky. "He has your mother's honor, you know," the king said quietly as she approached, knowing she would understand who he meant. "Philip, he has her strength, her goodness." "He does," Catherine agreed softly, coming to stand beside him. "And he has your resolve, Leopold. You have so much to be proud of. I have so much to regret," he whispered, the words heavy with a pain that was still raw. "I never said goodbye. I never told her I was sorry. I never even knew they had sent her away. My parents told me she had left on her own accord. that she didn't love me. I believed them. I let my bitterness harden me, and I became this. Catherine placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch a source of comfort he had come to cherish more than anything. She had a choice. She could leave the past where it was, a sleeping dragon in the dungeons of their memory. Or she could do the thing that terrified her, the thing that could risk her own happiness. But the one thing she knew was right. "It is not too late, my love," she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet room. He looked at her confused. "What do you mean?" "The past is not a ghost, Leopold. It is a woman who raised our son into the incredible man he is today. A woman who also deserves peace," the Queen said, her courage unwavering. "You cannot heal a wound by ignoring it. You must tend to it." She took a deep breath, her love for her husband giving her the strength for this final, selfless act. "Write to her," she urged, her eyes shining with a profound grace. "Invite Lady Evelyn to court. As our guest, tell her you are sorry. Hear her story. Let her see the son she raised become the prince he was born to be. You both deserve peace, Leopold. It is the only way our future can truly begin." The king stared at his wife, his heart filled with an overwhelming sense of awe and love. For 30 years he had been haunted by one woman, all while failing to see the incredible, selfless, and truly noble queen who had stood by his side. Her love was not a consolation, it was his salvation. He took her hand and brought it to his lips, his tears falling onto her skin. "How?" he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "Did I ever deserve a queen like you?" The letter was sent, and the reply was swift. Lady Evelyn would arrive within the week. The palace hummed with a nervous energy, a sense of a final chapter, long overdue, about to be written. King Leopold was a man undone by anticipation, pacing the halls, his eyes constantly scanning the long drive. When the carriage finally arrived, it was Philip and Margaret who greeted it first. A woman of elegant bearing stepped out, her hair silvered at the temples, but her eyes, Philip's eyes, were as bright and intelligent as ever. She was not dressed in the high fashion of the court, but in the quiet, dignified style of a country duchess. "Mother," Philip breathed, his voice thick with emotion as he embraced her. "My son," Evelyn whispered, her hands cupping his face. "My prince." Her gaze then shifted to Margaret, who stood shyly beside him. A warm, genuine smile lit up Evelyn's face. She took Margaret's hands in her own. "And you must be the princess who captured his heart. He wrote to me about you. His letters were filled with such love, I feel I know you already." Margaret curtsied. "It is an honor, Lady Evelyn." "The honor is all mine, my dear." As they stood on the grand steps, Queen Catherine emerged from the palace. She moved with a grace that was all her own, her expression open and welcoming. The two women, the one who had first captured the king's heart and the one who had finally healed it, stood before each other. There was no rivalry, no tension. There was only a quiet, profound respect, a silent acknowledgement of their shared connection to the same man and the same story. "Lady Evelyn," the Queen said, her voice warm, "welcome to Thornwyck. We are so very glad you are here. Our home is your home." Evelyn curtsied deeply, her own admiration evident. "Your Majesty, your kindness precedes you. I see now it was a profound understatement. Thank you for welcoming me." Later that day, after Evelyn had settled in, the Queen found her husband in the library. "Leopold," she said softly, "the roses in the West Garden are in bloom. Perhaps you would like to show them to Lady Evelyn. I believe they were always her favorite." He understood. It was a gift from his wife, a moment of privacy. He found Evelyn by the fountain, and for a long moment they simply stood in the quiet of the garden, the silence of 3 decades stretching between them. It was Leopold who spoke first, his voice raw with a lifetime of regret. "I was a boy, Evelyn, a coward. I should have fought for you. I should have protected you. For all these years I have lived with the shame of it. I am so sorry." Evelyn's expression was one of immense compassion. "You were a boy, Leopold." she agreed softly. And you were deceived. The king looked at her, confused. Deceived. Your parents came to me after you had left for your summer tour, she explained, her voice even, without a trace of bitterness. They told me you had agreed to an arranged marriage, that you wished me gone. They offered me an estate, a new title, and a lifetime of security for our child, on one condition, that I disappear and never contact you again. They said if I refused, they would ensure you paid the price for the scandal. I did it to protect you. The truth hit Leopold with the force of a physical blow. All these years he had carried a double burden, the grief of losing her and the bitterness that she had abandoned him. To learn now that she had left to protect him, and that his own parents were the architects of his lifelong misery, it was a devastating, yet liberating, revelation. The bitterness that had poisoned his heart for so long finally washed away, leaving only a great, aching sadness. "We were children," he whispered, tears tracing paths down his cheeks. "We were," she agreed, placing a gentle, reassuring hand on his arm. "But we raised a son to be proud of. He has your strength, and I hope, my honor. That is the story that matters now." The king looked at this woman, the love of his youth, and felt not the sting of a lost romance, but the peaceful closure of a chapter finally laid to rest. He was free. He returned to the palace a changed man. He walked directly to the Queen's solar, where Catherine was arranging flowers. He said nothing, but walked to her, took her hand, and looked at her with a lifetime of newfound love and gratitude in his eyes. She was not the woman he had lost. She was the queen who had saved him. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that his heart was finally, completely, and forever hers. A new-found peace settled over Thornwyck Palace. With the weight of his guilt lifted, King Leopold's true nature, the kind and honourable man the Queen had always known was there, began to shine. His love for his wife was evident in every glance, his pride in his son and new daughter boundless. Lady Evelyn, now a cherished guest, spent her days getting to know the remarkable son she had raised and the wonderful princess he had married. She and Queen Catherine formed a fast and easy friendship, often seen walking together in the gardens, two queens of the same story, finally at peace. A week into her stay, the palace's quiet routine was joyfully interrupted by the arrival of the Queen's brother, Lord Charles Devereux. Where Catherine was serene and composed, Charles was a whirlwind of charismatic energy. At 48, 5 years Evelyn's junior, he possessed a boyish charm, a quick wit, and mischievous eyes that promised he never took life too seriously. He strode into the Queen's solar, bypassing all formality to wrap his sister in a warm hug. "Catherine, my dear sister," he boomed. "Still presiding over this dreary old castle, I see. Have you not yet tired of it and run away to join a travelling theatre troupe with me?" The Queen laughed, a genuine musical sound. "Charles, you are incorrigible, and you will behave yourself. We have important guests." "Guests are my specialty," he said with a wink. Later that afternoon, as he and the Queen were taking tea in the conservatory, his boast was put to the test. Lady Evelyn, on her way to the library, passed by the open glass doors. She was bathed in the afternoon sun, a picture of quiet grace and timeless beauty. Charles stopped mid-sentence, his cup frozen halfway to his lips. His playful demeanour vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated captivation. "Good heavens, Catherine," he breathed, his voice low. "Who is that? Do not tell me you have been hiding such a vision in these halls." The Queen followed his gaze, and a slow, amused smile spread across her face. This she had not expected. "Charles, you must behave," she chided gently, though her eyes danced with mirth. "That is Lady Evelyn, Prince Philip's mother, and she is far too sensible for a known scoundrel like you." "Sensible. Perfect," he declared, setting his cup down with a decisive click. "I have been told I am in desperate need of some sense. And her age. She must be. A few years your senior. The Queen finished for him, raising a teasing eyebrow. You would never be able to keep up. A vintage wine is always superior to a new one, my dear sister. The flavor is far more complex, he retorted smoothly. Now, are you going to introduce me, or must I resort to fainting at her feet? Unable to resist her brother's charm, the Queen agreed. She led him to the library, where Evelyn was perusing the shelves. Lady Evelyn, the Queen said, may I present my incorrigible younger brother, Lord Charles Devereux? Charles took Evelyn's hand, bowing over it with a gallantry that was both theatrical and deeply sincere. Lady Evelyn, he said, his eyes never leaving hers, my sister has committed a grave sin by failing to mention that a guest of such radiance was gracing the palace. This old castle is suddenly much brighter. Evelyn felt a faint blush rise to her cheeks, a sensation she had not felt in 30 years. She had been a mother, a widow, a duchess, roles of quiet dignity. The role of a beautiful woman being admired was a costume she had long since put away. You are too kind, my lord, she replied, her voice composed, though she felt a flutter of surprise. I am merely honest, he said, his smile warm and genuine. I am told you are fond of the gardens. Might I have the honor of escorting you on a walk tomorrow morning? Evelyn, caught off guard by his forward but charming request, found herself unable to refuse. I would like that very much, Lord Charles. As he walked away, leaving her with a respectful bow, Evelyn stood for a moment in the quiet of the library, a small, bewildered smile touching her lips. She had come to the palace to find closure for her past. She had never imagined she might also find the beginning of a new future.
I came in like shadows, no name on my chest, wore a footman's coat, and I buried the rest. Mama said he's not a villain, just a man torn apart. But I came with my doubts and a cracked, guarded heart.
They said I was mouthy, too sharp for my place, but she called me her starlight while I brushed out her grace. In a palace of marble, with my feet on the floor, I told stories of love while dreaming of more.
But the crown don't make the heart, and a title don't make it true. Sometimes love walks in barefoot with nothing grand to prove. It's in the wounds that we carry and the hands we don't let go. If love is strong enough, even kings can be overthrown.
He cast her to me like a sentence, not a vow. Didn't know I'd already loved her somehow. She laughed when I stumbled, patched up my pride. Didn't take long, for she walked right inside.
I thought I lost everything, my dreams, my name, but he looked at me like I was worth every flame. We were forced into vows with the whole court to see, but somehow that night he just held me.
Turns out my father was colder than stone, but beneath all that silence, he still felt alone. Mama forgave him long before she died. I just needed time to look through her eyes.
The Queen called me daughter, with tears in her eyes, said you've given us endings where hope never tries. And the king, oh the king, with a voice low and cracked, he said, I see her in you. And he finally looked back. 'Cause the crown don't make the heart, and pain don't make it right. But sometimes broken people still find their way to light. It's not the halls or the stories, it's the way he said my name. And how even a maid with a broom can wear love like a flame.
Thought I was nothing more than what they threw away, but she danced with my silence and taught it to stay. Now I look at my father and I understand that forgiveness ain't weak, it's what makes us a man.
They called me a dreamer, silly and sweet, but my dreams had fire and calloused feet. I never needed a prince to lift me up high, just someone who'd see me and not ask why.
So here's to the secrets, the shame and the scars, to the love that outlasted the dust and the wars, to the queen, to the maid, to the boy in disguise, and the man who learned how to apologize.
'Cause the crown don't make the heart, and the past don't seal our fate. We all wear rags and glory in the moments we're brave. It's not the blood or the story, it's who shows up in the end. And how sometimes the footman is the fairy tale's best friend.